Hey, all. Thanks for listening to Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt. Today, I was talking with Sandhya Jha. She has written a fabulous book called Transforming Communities, How People Like You Are Healing Their Neighborhoods. It's a book about community organizing. It's a book about good stories. It's a book about the way people can live in the world. It's something I'd really encourage you to take a read of. Sandhya also runs a podcast. So if you're listening to this podcast, you're obviously somebody who listens to podcasts. You might want to give hers a try. Stories from the Hood. And you can look up Sandhya Jha. Her name is spelled Sandhya, Sandhya. So when you're Googling around or looking through your podcast list, you can find her there. Brought to you by Chalice Press, by the way. Hey, thanks so much for being part of the podcast. I really appreciate it. It's November 7th today, the one-year anniversary of the election of Donald Trump as the President of the United States. So I hope this little bit of goodness for you in this day or in this season is an encouragement for you. I appreciate you being part of the podcast. If you appreciate the podcast, I'd love to have you be a contributor, a patron, if you like. Happens over at a little website called Patreon. It's a chance for you to click there and donate $1, $5, $10 a month, something like that. That helps make all this podcast possible and happen. I really would appreciate you taking a look. You can find it at dougpagitt.com if you're not already on Patreon, or you can just search for patreon.com as well. So here it is, my fun and great conversation with Sandhya Jha on her book, Transforming Communities. Now we're talking with Doug Pagitt, the podcast that's also a live stream. So we're live streaming here on Facebook. And this is Sandhya Jha, and she has written a spectacular book that I hope you will all know about called Transforming Communities. And I'm just going to take 1 second here and change the settings on this.
Absolutely.
And make it live. So, friends, if you are already wanting to share this because you're like, oh my gosh, I want everyone I know to know about Sandhya's book, I think that's a good idea, and you should do that. You should share it around wherever you find your ability to share podcasts and all the rest of it. Well, Sandhya, congratulations. The book is called Transforming Communities, How People Like You Are Healing Their Neighborhoods. So tell us a little bit about what your context in which you're able to talk so eloquently in the book about the ability to transform neighborhoods.
So I'm really excited about this because a lot of my work is in Oakland, California, and it's a city that a lot of people have written off as if all Oakland is known for is its violence or its proximity to San Francisco. But what I've learned is that the best of what happens in this city isn't because of politicians. It's not because of foundations. It's not because of outside experts coming in and fixing things.
Really?
But it's the real wisdom and generosity of spirit and lived experience of people who have lived and loved and lost in this community and who have realized they can be part of the solution to the problems. I kind of feel like in this particular moment when we're all feeling pretty overwhelmed by how bad things seem, that there's a lesson in that for all of us, that it turns out regular folks are in fact the best solution to the problems we face in our communities.
So I didn't know that people had the attitude about Oakland that they had written it off. Is that something you feel as an Oaklandite?
It's interesting because that was maybe more the case 10 years ago. Now the attitude about Oakland is that it's the trendy, hip, slightly more affordable sister to San Francisco. But for a long time, all people knew about it was that it was a violent place. I think a lot of former industrial towns, that's kind of all people know. That's the only narrative of Flint or Detroit or Akron. So a lot of communities that people have given up on actually have much more powerful stories than we hear. And I think that was true for Oakland because it was well known for being one of the most violent cities in the country for a long time.
Sandhya, how did you get to Oakland? How did you end up living in such a violent city?
So I'm a pastor, and I'm not necessarily proud of this, but I fell in love with the building of First Christian Church of Oakland, and the congregation kind of came along with the package. And it took me a while to realize what an amazing congregation it was.
So you're in the disciples of Christ,
I
that
am.
tradition. That's the Christian churches like that. And what, you like were living already in Oakland, or you were traveling through and said, "Hey, there's a building. I think I'll become
I was working for what we would call our region, which is like a diocese or a middle judicatory. And I was only intending on being there for a short period of time, but someone said, "You're going to like Oakland." And I visited First Christian Church of Oakland, which in its heyday had 1,500 people in worship. And when I got there to preach, had 10. So
Wow.
it was a very different congregation, but still in a 40,000 square foot facility. And the possibilities for what that could mean for this community, I think, jumped out at me pretty early on.
And when was that? When was early on?
2005, 2006.
Okay, so you've been at it a long time.
For a little while, yeah.
And this notion that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, was that something you sort of knew in theory going into this? Did you learn that in this community? How did that?
I think my whole career has been a reminder of that, because I started out, my first kind of grown up after college job was working in Congress. And I had this real sense that we were going to change everything at the national level. I was working for a member with vast integrity, deeply committed to bipartisanship, deeply loyal to the working people of Akron, Ohio. And we couldn't move anything. And nothing was changing. And yet on Sunday mornings, I would go in and talk with the junior high and high school kids in the Sunday school class at my church, and realized they actually had more capacity to change things, it felt like, than my boss, in theory, one of the 435 most powerful people in America. So yeah, I think I started learning that lesson early on in my career, and it's been proven time and again. We keep looking for that one savior, and it turns out the savior is us together.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, on a day like today, that is awfully good news for me to hear from people who are listening on the podcast. It is November 7th, which is the 1-year anniversary of what I refer to as the dark day in 2016, when the election of the president didn't go the direction that I so deeply desired that it would. And I'll tell you, there have been I'm a pastor as well, and there have been a lot of days, for a long time, but especially over the last 365, where I have said, I got to quit doing what I'm doing and get to Congress and try to make some change in this world, because no matter what I'm doing on the small level, it gets obliterated by this bigger wave of what's happening. And so it's such good news to talk to you today, to maybe have a little different perspective for those of us that are working, in smaller environments. And I don't mean smaller as in not as important, but smaller in just size and their impact, that it can just feel like it all gets washed away. I think about those people who have experienced a hurricane, and they work so hard to rebuild that dock, and then it just in one storm surge is just taken out. So, but you've concluded differently. You used to have a foot in that kind of national public world, and now you're.
Yeah, and so I write about this in the book a little bit, and I think this is important. It's not just all we should focus on is little stuff and everything will get fixed. I think it's worth taking a step back historically. So after I worked in Congress, I worked for a national interfaith organization that was organizing as best we could against the religious right, which was really powerful.
What group was that?
The organization I worked for was the Interfaith Alliance. And we kind of, along with Americans United for the Separation of Church and State and People for the American Way and all of these good liberal groups, were really trying to move things in regard to what was then the really powerful force, the Christian Coalition. I've come to realize that the moment we're in right now is the result of 50 years of really intentional work that started with very local work by the religious right, addressing, and they were working on things like taking over school boards and taking over city councils. And so there was a real intentional, strategic, political approach they were taking, because they knew if they started local, they could shift the culture that led to this kind of moment. The Tea Party didn't emerge out of nowhere. Donald Trump didn't emerge out of nowhere. This is part of 50 years of changing American attitudes about what it means to care for the poor and what it means to be working on racial reconciliation. Our frameworks are different than they were 50 years ago, and that's not by accident. So I do think working at the local level matters. I think it actually can have massive national results. And wouldn't it be amazing if little by little we started turning this country into a country that believes in love, that believes in compassion, that believes in prioritizing the voices of people who are marginalized? That could be what America is. It could be what America is within the next 50 years if we really buckle down community by community.
Do you have any sense about why? Faith, hope, and love, kindness, generosity. Those have been in the flow of especially Christian religious people for a very long time. Do you have any senses as to why that doesn't catch on more? Why it's not more sticky? Why it's not working better?
I think there's something it's worth us remembering. When we read the Bible and it talks over and over again about love and it talks over and over again about compassion, and when one of the most frequently used phrases in the Bible is fear not, that's not because people in biblical times were loving and compassionate and without fear. It says it that often because human beings' tendency is towards turning inwards, towards being fearful and protecting ourselves rather than being generous. The things that we're calling our community into are disciplines. And they're things that you have to constantly practice in order to be able to live into them. And they have to be practiced consistently and with integrity if they're actually going to have an effect on a whole community and get people bought in on it being the better way of being. So I think that's part of what makes it hard. Fear is easier. Condemnation's easier. Retaliation's easier. They will lead to our ultimate destruction. But in the moment, they're less daunting. I think that's part of why.
Yeah, boy, I think you're right. I also have this little suspicion that some of the more progressively minded people that I would like to, align myself with, I think a lot of us have believed a very important truth that our actions ought to speak louder than our words. But if we let our words be nearly silent, it doesn't take much for our actions to be louder than our words. Feels to me like we need to raise the volume, turn up the volume a bit on the words. I find a number of times in myself and in people that, I partner with, that it's very common to want to reach for a Gandhi quote or a Rumi quote or a King quote before you would a Jesus quote, or for Christian people, or an Apostle Paul quote, right? But so there's this way of like quieting our religious narratives in order to not be exclusivist or offensive. Right. But we live in this country in which that tact, that religious impulse really carries a lot of weight for a lot of people. And I have felt that a lot of religious people who take their faith that's really important to them, they can't find a space inside of progressive circles, even progressive religious circles or Christian circles, where they can talk about that very, very adamantly. What's your sense of that, living on the ground and working on the ground in these communities and being out?
So this is what's so much. So one of my chapters is on faith-rooted organizing. I know that's a model that you're familiar with and embrace. And it has been so much fun using the model of faith-rooted organizing, not just traditional. Now, I'm a big fan of labor unions and I'm a big fan of community organizing, but to be able to do organizing where we can speak fully from the riches of our faith traditions, I have found that to resonate much more deeply with the people I work with than something where they can't claim who they fully are as part of the work. It's actually really liberating. And it turns out to be more inclusive because if I bring my full, passionate, faithful Christian voice into the room and assume that when I'm organizing alongside a Muslim, I am looking for his or her Muslim wisdom to be shaping what brings them into the space. We learn more about each other's faith. We organize more effectively. We're grounded in what we share because we actually talk about what we believe. And I think that there's something really liberating about that. Some of the most inspiring and joy-filled social justice work I do is with people who are passionately faithful people, and who are unapologetic about that.
Yeah, boy. Well, good for you. I hope you'll champion this for all of us going forward, because we need leaders like you. It's almost like we need a national coming out day for progressive religious people, right? Like, all right, fine, I'll admit it, and start to say, yeah, that it's because for a lot of us, it is actually our faith that causes us to move in these progressive, what we did call culturally or politically progressive directions.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It sure gets lost. And okay, so in the book, I noticed in the table of contents, first of all, congratulations on finding a form by which your table of contents can make sense. I'm an author, and I'm in that process right now, and I cannot figure out
it's a nightmare, isn't it?
What to call the chapters. So for the non-authors, they just assume that comes easy. It is.
Yeah, really. Chapter titles are hard.
It is, because it's like the chapter titles work for maybe 3/5 of the chapters. And then you're like, oh, but that's not really what anyway. But every one of yours starts with the power of.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, this little book that's so adorable in its design and readable and
thanks, Chalice
attainable.
Press, for making it that way. Yeah.
Hey, congratulations to Chalice Press, the finest in book publishing. So it has this very winsome sense to it, right? The whole book, it's called Transforming Communities, How People Like You Are Healing Their Neighborhoods. Yeah. That has this kind of nurturing, this sort of soft, but the content is actually about power. And you're recognizing that there's a lot of power without being brutal or without being bossy, or like it's another way to get at this whole notion of power.
Yes, absolutely. And I think so part of the reason for that is it is so easy to feel powerless right now with everything that's going on in this country. I mean, I look at all of the legislation that's being passed that is harmful to women, to people of color, to immigrants, to Muslims, to LGBT folks. It is really easy to feel like we don't have any power. And as dysfunctional as our democracy feels right now, being reminded that actually, in theory, the power in this country lies within us when we come together, and that power doesn't have to naturally be a negative thing, that actually there are old songs about there is power in the blood, and a lot of progressive Christians have changed the lyrics to there is power in the love. Mm-hmm. I don't know that that's a bad edit. Right. I think for us to remember that love is not the opposite of power.
That's right.
But love is the best way that power can manifest.
Yeah. So what do you think's behind that progressive sense and that caution or that apprehension about power and accomplishment? There seems to be something there.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it is easy for folks who have a lot of privilege to want to get rid of that, because it feels like part of the problem is having access to that power. Right. Yep. As if the solution is ditching the power, when in fact the solution is sharing the power. When we are accountable to each other, when we are making sure that power is equally distributed and accountability is equally shared, that's when we start living into what Dr. King referred to as the beloved community. It's not just about warm and fuzzy feelings. It's actually about access and opportunity and accountability. It's about how power gets used, not about no one having power.
Right. So in the book, you do this great job of sort of combining these stories of small local things inside of this national understanding of what's going on. It kind of moves right between the context in the larger sense and the specific context in the local sense. Yeah. For people who, especially on this Tuesday or any day after they're listening to this, who are looking for a little good news on the community side, do you have a favorite bit in the book? Do you have a favorite story that you tell about, or a favorite group or at least maybe it's just today's favorite, right? I know you don't like to pick favorites, but right.
There's one that's resting on my heart a lot, right? It depends on the day of the week, which story's jumping out at me. Mm-hmm. And part of it is, if you care about the criminal justice system being broken, you don't have to start by saying, how do we dismantle all of the prisons in America? You can start by saying, how do we start practicing restorative justice models in my community. Because actually, when you do that long enough and broad enough, you can begin to create alternatives to the way prisons function in our community. I'm watching that happen. People who've been doing it long enough are already seeing effects. So right now, I imagine that for you and as well as for me, something that's resting on my heart right now is the shooting in Texas on Sunday, where, again, one of our houses of worship was under attack. And so the story that really is coming to my mind right now is some people have forgotten the Oak Creek Massacre, where a Sikh temple in Wisconsin was attacked in another mass killing. But that happened not so long ago, maybe about 6 years ago. And I have a chapter on how the Sikh young adults in that community actually took that opportunity to engage in recognizing their role in standing up against violence, their role in helping demystify their religion so that people wouldn't feel threatened. And also, I mean, they showed up at Sandy Hook to support the people in that community who had lost people to senseless gun violence. And also in that chapter, I talk about Jewish and Muslim women coming together to support each other when they feel under threat. And the whole resources section is, what are ways that we can be building up safe congregation practices, not just for our own congregations, but knowing that Muslim mosques and Jewish synagogues and Sikh temples are also under attack. How do we build up safe congregation practices so we can be protecting each other? Because maybe we are actually our brother's keeper in this moment. And this isn't just about how do I protect me and mine, but how do I build up a community where we know we're protecting each other and keeping each other safe? So those amazing young adults in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, who went through such horrific violence, much like what our brothers and sisters in Texas just went through, for them to turn that into an opportunity to stand up for peace and inclusion and to support other victims of violence, that's a pretty big deal. And in the process, they actually helped make sure that our government finally started tracking hate crimes against Sikhs, which they hadn't been doing. So there were actually huge national ramifications as well.
When you were walking into that church that you liked the building so much, and then later fell in love with the people, I'm sure.
Yes, yes, I did.
All 10 of them. It could be very easy for someone in your situation to say, "Look, I've got enough work to do to try to make my primary role as a pastor here even be a possibility and make this community transform into something more meaningful or to thrive." How much pressure did you feel, or how difficult was that to navigate doing that work in the church and the work you also wanted to do in the community, and also paying attention around the country, right? Those are three different sensibilities in some ways. And that's a difficult thing to do. And you seem to be doing it particularly well. And I think for some people who, no matter what their work is, whether they're in businesses or nonprofits, or they manage their own lives at home or whatever, or churches, they're trying to figure that out too. How do you have multiple commitments at the same time? It's a difficult thing. How did you do it?
I think that's a good question. I think part of the reason the congregation had declined so much was being inward focused and functioning out of a certain amount of fear. And what was interesting was when we really started making the big shift was when I started asking the question, what is it that this congregation thinks it has to offer this neighborhood? And what I learned in that process, and I don't know if I had the language at the time, but what I learned in that process was people in my church weren't just congregants. They were human beings who functioned within the culture and community of Oakland, California, right? They were teachers. They worked at a TV station. They worked at the college. They struggled to pay their bills. They lived on the streets. I mean, they knew Oakland. And so when I asked, what is it that this church is being called to offer the community, they said, we want to be a place of peace and tranquility in the midst of violence. Now, in theory, every church could make that claim.
For sure.
But in a city where almost all of us who have been here for any amount of time have lost people to violence, that means something different. It was a tangible connection to what it was to be in this city. And so at that point, we started reaching out and developing relationships with nonprofits, non-religious nonprofits for the most part, in our community, who also knew how important it was to address violence. And so if you want to fast forward, we just celebrated the 5th anniversary of the Oakland Peace Center, which the church created, which is a collective of 40 different nonprofit organizations working together to create peace in Oakland. Last year, so the congregation's still a tiny little congregation, but last year, the Oakland Peace Center partners reached over 86,000 people.
Incredible.
And so there's something about a congregation recognizing that its salvation, its literal salvation, rests in being in deeper relationship with its community and learning that the community's needs and concerns and heartbreaks and joys are the same as those within the congregation.
Yeah.
That I think was the turning point for us.
Boy, I'll tell you, that is so insightful. The idea that the people in your congregation are also people part of this. It's shocking how many church leaders don't go there early enough or often enough. Right. So especially if congregations start to get a little larger.
Yes.
And are in that trouble. I've been with a lot of pastors and asked them if they know what the people in their congregation do for work. And often they don't. Or if they ever even been to their office. Do they know anything about their... And here these same people, like most people don't separate the goodness they do in the world in their family or their neighborhood or their church or their work. And then churches tend to divide that up into, well, that's not officially a church thing. So for you to take the approach that, hey, all these people don't just have a need and a want to receive, which they do and they should be carried, but they also carry. They're also carriers at another point. And to see that simultaneity, right? That simultaneously they are caregivers and in need. And all of us are that way. Boy, that's incredible. Do you think that's... I think
it was actually one of the gifts that Jesus offered to his community back in the day, was saying,
Easy does it with
this
the Jesus
doesn't have
talk.
to be a closed set. Our spirituality can be, in the streets, in our, at the dinner table, in all of these spaces, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm hearing you say that reminds me that where Jesus asked that man, oftentimes in these miracle narratives, he'll say to them, what do you want?
Yes.
Right? Like, why don't you start there?
Exactly.
What do you want? What are your desires? What are your passions? What are the things that drive you and make you in the world? It's amazing how often our work to transform communities doesn't become work of people.
Right.
And I'm sure, and that's what this book is about, by the way. So if people want to know that it's a very people-centric approach. Yeah. I would say.
And recognizing people not just as recipients, but as also sharers of wisdom, people with gifts, people with wisdom, people who bring, and neighborhoods also, not just benighted, suffering, tragic neighborhoods, but neighborhoods with resilience and ideas and hopes and dreams. And I think we don't often enough pause to look at that.
Who do you hope reads this book? And that's short of everyone, right? So assuming that of the 7 billion people on the planet, statistically speaking, most people won't buy a copy. Right. But of the people who
Although 7 billion copies sold would be awesome, right?
That'd be killer. Someone would start to say, I think you're part of the tree problem if you sold 7 billion of these. Who in your dreams, in your mind, do you hope gets their hands on this? Like what when it lands in that spot, who is the kind of person or community that you say, oh, I am so glad, because that's what I was secretly hoping for.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, because I've had that moment with my last book a few times, and it's really exciting when it happens. So for me, it's the person who knows things could be better and doesn't know where to start, and doesn't necessarily think that they by themselves can make a difference. I chose these stories very intentionally because they're about, you were mentioning, we tend to, we think about Gandhi, we think about, Martin Luther King, and they were just men also.
Right.
But we've trapped them in amber and turned them into these superheroes that we can't aspire to being. None of us thinks of ourselves as a Mother Teresa. But I chose these stories to remind folks that it was somebody just like you who didn't have necessarily superpowers, wasn't necessarily the most charismatic or fascinating or visionary person. It was just somebody who thought, I wish this were different in my neighborhood. And they talked to people and discovered there were other people who felt the same way. And they came across some concrete tools that they put into effect. So ideally, somebody picks this book up and says, oh, wait, I feel like my neighborhood is trapped in this us versus them binary. And if we could get a truth commission going to talk about this issue that we think only has two sides, we'll discover there are 5 sides, and we'll actually be able to find a way through this conflict. Or I'm really, really sad about how many men in my neighborhood go to prison. Here's the process by which I could start doing restorative justice circles in my neighborhood crime prevention group, and that we could change the culture of this neighborhood so that prison's not the only option for our young men, for example. Or something even more simple than that. But those are the, if you're looking around and thinking, it doesn't need to be like this and I don't know what to do, that's who I hope picks up this book.
Oh, great. And it's ideal for groups too, by the way. So for people that want to, buy a bunch of copies for their friends. And
I'm actually really excited. A friend of mine said her discerning clergy group is going to be reading it. And she said that what they meant by discerning clergy is clergy who are in churches and are not sure that their churches are going to be how their communities get changed, and are trying to figure out how to be a part of changing the world if it's not in their parishes. And my hope is that some of them read it and realize where they can be doing that work instead. And some of them read it and realize there's a way maybe they can do it in their church.
Yeah. Okay. So two big problems that I see in the world, and I love your input on them. One is, let's start with the clergy. Oftentimes,
is that one of the problems in the world? Is the clergy?
Oh, that was a little subconscious. Oftentimes, those of us who are leading communities, church communities especially, feel like we have a limited amount of resource and work and things we can do in the world. So we want to put most of our energies into the kinds of things where we're taking the lead. And it doesn't feel like good stewardship of our time and energy and resource of the church to be a smaller player in a larger project.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the most generous way I can say that oftentimes people leading churches will only participate in things if it primarily benefits them or if they're leading it.
Absolutely.
How does someone get themselves over that hump if they feel like they have some responsibility to the church to not let the church be a bit player in a larger process?
That's a really good question. And it involves an awful lot of trust. What's interesting is if we don't trust our congregations, then of course we're not going to be able to trust any broader system.
Wow.
And that's a theological issue I can't delve into in a very brief fashion. One thing I do want to say, though, is somebody asked me how we had chosen the organizations that were part of the Oakland Peace Center. There's over 200 nonprofits in Oakland. Our problems are not the result of a lack of nonprofits. But I realized that we had been unconsciously operating out of a phrase that I have since learned from the movement for Black Lives, the Black Lives Matter movement, where they talk about being low ego, high impact. And I have to admit, I do think that the theological crisis in the church has a lot to do with ego. Let me say it this way, has a lot to do with not delving into the spiritual discipline of humility. That's actually what I mean to say.
Say that again.
I love having learned from the movement for Black Lives that part of how we can thrive is being low ego for the sake of being high impact.
That's great. Can you say that phrase again? That you just
low ego, high impact.
No, but then you said there's
the crisis of not delving into the spiritual discipline of humility.
The spiritual discipline of humility. That's fantastic, because there's a lot of churches that feel like their churches are in real humble situations and they need to kind of raise it up.
Yes.
And you're saying find a way for that to actually be the spiritual.
And in fact, who encourage their pastors to be the big, bold leader that they can be proud of. And I think part of that's because we've got a skewed way of defining power. The skewed way we define power in this country is part of why we have the president we have, because we can't recognize power in a non-toxic context. We can't imagine shared power as actually being powerful. We think it needs to be contained within an individual who then leads us strongly and forcefully.
I mean, it's
I
amazing.
don't think that was the community Jesus envisioned at all.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he would have just chosen one disciple instead of 12.
That's right. It's a little hard to get to that storyline out of the Jesus narrative, isn't it? But boy, churches find their way in it. Well, that's great advice for the clergy. Here's the second dilemma that seems to be facing us. And that is, it's really hard for a lot of us to not feel like we have to stop a raging crisis before we can play the long game. And for some of us, what happens is people expressing opinions that seem so counter to the goodness we want in the world feels like one of those crises that we're facing. So we can become totally obsessed with just stopping that bad thing from happening, those people saying those things, thinking those things, doing those things, that we feel like this is not the moment to play the long game. This is the moment of this kind of surge of urgency. And the last year has felt like it's been just a constancy for some of us. My conservative friends feel like they finally, the pressure was finally off.
They finally get to relax. Yeah.
But for some of us, it has felt like, we don't have time to make friends here. All of a sudden people turn into like they're on some reality show thing where they're thinking, I'm not here to make friends. I'm here for impact. And if that impact means I've got to tell you to, you see where I'm going with this?
Yes.
Like we just end up shutting everybody down and shutting each other down to a point that there's a lot of fear that gets created by anyone saying the wrong thing, acting in the wrong way, all that. So what are your thoughts about that really powerful impulse that a lot of people have to just want to do something of impact, and that creates this sense of having to shut other people up or shut other people out?
Yeah. So I think that there's an expression people use about the tyranny of the urgent displacing the important. And I think that that's really true. Now, I do also recognize there are real lives at stake. So I don't want to say we shouldn't pay attention to urgent issues. I do also think, though, that how we are in the world, that the process by which we get to the ends actually determines the ends. I didn't make that up. I feel like Gandhi talked about that. I feel like Jesus talked about that who we are being in the process shapes the end results. And this notion of by any means necessary tends to lead to bad results. I think it is good for us to have a sense of urgency around things that involve people's lives being at stake. I was having a conversation recently with someone who said, don't we need to be focusing more on civility? Don't we have an obligation to be listening carefully to the people who disagree with us? I think that is really important. And I don't think that everybody needs to be in all of those conversations. So I'm stepping out on a limb here. Bear with me a little bit.
Yeah.
The person I was having this conversation with happened to be a lesbian. And I said, so do you need to be in a conversation with everyone who thinks that you are an abomination to God? And she said, no, I am done with that conversation. And I said, right. It is my obligation as a straight Christian who knows a God of love, who is all inclusive. It's my job to be in the conversations with people who see that issue differently. Now, when it comes to issues of immigration, I maybe shouldn't be the one extending all of the emotional energy in having a conversation with someone who thinks that my whole family should get deported back to wherever we came from.
Right.
Maybe that's where someone who is a third-generation American can step in and have that necessary, compassionate conversation.
Yeah, it's almost like that metaphor of functioning as a body, that there's different roles that people play, and maybe that's part of people figuring out in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in their churches, or in their neighborhood groups, to try to figure out who's going to do what here, and not expect that if someone's not doing what you're doing is not because they don't care about it.
Yes. And I think also to engage in those conversations with compassion for the people who differ from us, while also always holding in mind that these conversations are about real human lives, that these aren't just academic conversations, that these aren't just abstractions, because that's the other side of the danger of let's just sit down and talk about it.
Yeah. You know, there's this old thing that people do with, some people do with fortune cookies, you know, where you open the fortune cookie, you read the fortune, and then you end it with the phrase "in bed." And it sort of makes fun of that.
Yes.
I've wondered if in these kinds of dialogues, if for Christian people especially, if they were to finish their statement or their approach, their way, their presentation to someone with, because I love you and value you as a person, you know, made and expressing the fullness of God. Like if that's the phrase you had to finish with, it starts to orient the approach you have, because it's really hard to believe what this phrase I like from the Apostle Paul a lot, where he writes, it's God's kindness that leads us to repentance or to change, to turning.
That's absolutely true.
It's really hard to believe that as something other than, well, occasionally kindness also works, you know.
I know. We're really wrapped up in some debates about that here in the Bay Area, because a lot of young people who are disgusted and horrified, and rightfully so, by the fact that white supremacists have made a game out of antagonizing, particularly San Francisco and Berkeley. Many of my friends have pointed out the white supremacists never show up in Oakland because we're the home of the Black Panthers, and they know what would happen to them. But they have made a game out of showing up at bars and progressive bookstores and threatening either physically or verbally the people who work there. And there is definitely a lot of debate over whether it's morally justifiable or even just fun to punch Nazis, right? There's a lot of emotional energy going into violence versus nonviolence in the midst of this constant antagonism. I am really, the Oakland Peace Center, we are very much about challenging and dismantling broken and evil systems. And we are never about demonizing individuals. That becomes tricky when we're talking about issues like police brutality. Because a lot of us have some real feelings about our particular police department and its long history of that. But we try to focus on systems and simultaneously recognize that human beings are just caught up in those systems. And how do we hold them accountable, but hold them accountable in love? How do we recognize that a dysfunctional prison system is harming the prison guards as well?
It's a lot of work to become convinced that helping police officers to not act violently benefits the police officer too. Because sometimes, and a lot of us, and I'm in this group, there's moments where I think that I don't care about the police officer, right? I care about the victim only. But that's the kind of thing that feels to me is that Jesus call of loving yourself, your God, your neighbor, and your enemy without distinction or difference between those three. Man, this is that deep spiritual discipline that I know a lot of traditions have to offer, but I think Christianity has something really particular to offer that. And so does your book. I'm going to put it right online with,
well done. Thank you
up there with the scriptures. This is Sandhya Jha. Sandhya, tell us, her book is Transforming Communities, How People Like You Are Healing Their Neighborhoods and Ultimately the World. where else can people find you other than in print in your book? How would they stay up with you and what you're
Absolutely.
up to?
So I do have a webpage, sandhyajha.com. People are always welcome to come by the Oakland Peace Center and connect with the amazing work we do there.
Well, it's such a violent town. How would they ever feel comfortable getting to the Peace
Definitely
Center?
Drop me a line at Shonda at oaklandpeacecenter.com.
Great.
We would be thrilled to have you. And there's amazing programs going on all the time. And you can actually get to know some of those organizations through my podcast, Hope from the Hood, which really was kind of the origins of this book. Was I was feeling such a sense of despair about the world a few years back. And I was reminded that I needed stories of hope and that actually I was surrounded by them. And so I started interviewing the regular folks who took initiative to take on an issue of injustice or suffering in their communities and invite them to tell their stories. So that's really what my little podcast, Hope from the Hood, is all about.
There's no such thing as a little podcast. They're the greatest. There's only podcasts. I love it. Okay, so if people are looking that up, they can go to iTunes or go to your website,
yes.
Sandhya Jha, and it's spelled Sandhya, Shonda.
Yes.
And Jha is Jha.
That's correct.
Shonda, where does that name come from for people who now are saying,
so
how did you spell that?
Yeah, my father's from India and my mother is from Scotland. And they are kind of they're my role models for how to do reconciliation and justice well. They really kind of embody those things. And they just live their lives with so much integrity. It has taught me a whole bunch. And I'm shaped very much by both of those cultures. And I think that's where a lot of my dream for a reconciled world comes from, is having gotten to live within a family system where that was really practiced every day.
Fantastic. Well, what a pleasure to know you. Thank you for
Doug,
thanks for the book.
So
thanks for being a part of all this. And the book, again, is Transforming Communities. And it's put out by Chalice Press, the best press in the world. All right.
Thanks again. So grateful to be with you, Doug.